Then there's this big country across the sea called the United States of America, which, as you point out, is not yet the United States of America that we would be after World War II, a superpower. And it was more complicated for us. You know, we had fought a couple of wars with England in the past 100 years. And, you know, they're kind of wanting us to come over and help them and join the Allied forces. And we got the big ocean. And what was the mood of the American people at this time? And now we're like 1914 to 1917, right around there. And the war just, again, went from 14 to 18. So what was the mood of the Americans?
Well, I certainly don't think there was any great desire to get involved in the European war. I mean, we could judge, if by nothing else, the result of the 1916 election. Woodrow Wilson, who really at that point was actually running more or less on a peace platform of keeping the U.S. out of the war against Charles Hughes. The Republicans, oddly enough, back then were far more the party of kind of the Northeast and big business and with a lot of ties to Europe. And they were much more pro-interventionist and pro-Britain and France than Wilson's party, the Democrats, the base of which was still kind of, a lot of it was either labor or agrarian populism in the South. And Wilson himself had not wanted to get the U.S. into the war. In fact, Wilson gave a speech as late as January 1917, the so-called peace without victory speech, trying to some extent to use the leverage the U.S. now had over France and Britain, because they're buying a lot of their arms in the U.S. They're relying on Wall Street for the loans that are now paying for the war because they've effectively run out of gold. Their gold reserves are running down. The U.S. had leverage. In fact, there were a lot of ways in which the U.S. might, and this was kind of what Wilson was trying to do initially with the peace without victory speech, was to step in as a broker, as a mediator, to broker some type of a peace, perhaps of mutual exhaustion. Britain and France didn't want that, though, in part because Germany was still occupying parts of Belgium and France, and Germany had also occupied part of what had been Russian Poland. And so the Germans were at the time maybe more willing to parley than the Allies were. But then the Germans shot themselves in the foot by unleashing what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Effectively, this meant after the sinking of the Lusitania and other ships with Americans on board in 1915, the Germans had made the rules of engagement for their U-boat attacks on British merchant shipping and British naval vessels much stricter. Effectively, kind of, you'd have to give prior warning, to give time for women and children to get to the lifeboats, proverbially. Now the Germans was like, you know, basically the gloves were off, and they were just going to go ahead and fire, because the Germans themselves were suffering by that winter. Berlin, Vienna, all the cities of the Central Powers, you know, they're kind of slowly starving because of the British blockade. And so they thought, again, this kind of almost typical German self-sabotage, you know, rather than accepting Wilson's professed aims of negotiating a compromise peace at face value, the Germans said, you know what, we don't trust them. We think the U.S. is going to enter the war anyway, so we're just going to speed things along. So they did it first.
Yeah, they provoked us.
They provoked us, both with unrestricted submarine warfare and then with the Zimmermann telegram, which is just an astonishing mistake by the Germans.
Wait a second. Before we get to Zimmermann telegram, prior to them doing the unrestricted submarine warfare, which I understand, I can understand why Americans were like, no way, that's too much. You're taking out indiscriminately civilians on boats and so on. Prior to that, what was the lure to the Americans in getting further involved, right? Because, again, if you look at World War II, we're going to go fight Nazis. We're going to defeat Hitler. The Germans bomb, I'm doing my Animal House line. The Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, right? We had very clear reasons to get in. And this war, the way we're talking about it, it's like still remains somewhat amorphous to me why it was started even to begin with, even amongst the powers over there. Now it's expanding, and now they're asking us to get in. And I just wonder, like, were we like, wait, why are people calling us before the submarine warfare, the indiscriminate, like before that? What was the reason, ostensibly, for us to get in?
Well, it's much murkier than the Second World War. Not just the origins of the war, as you're pointing out, but why the U.S. gets involved, on what pretenses, for what purposes. I mean, these debates, they didn't die, of course, in 1917-18. I mean, they continued to roil American politics on into the 20s and 30s, when, in retrospect, it had come to seem like a mistake, and people couldn't quite fathom why the U.S. had gotten into the war. Now, on the moral side, there had been a lot of criticism of the German invasion of Belgium, a lot of what was then called kind of atrocity propaganda. Obviously, it wasn't all untrue. A lot of atrocities were committed. There was a famous library that burned down and Louvain. There were these kind of sharpshooters who would periodically take out civilians. There were obviously some genuine crimes committed in the invasion of Belgium. But that said, the British and the French were just really good at kind of manipulating American public opinion, in part because they had a long experience of doing so. And also, by 1916, 1917, there were just a lot of American interests that were increasingly aligned with Britain and France. But again, it was not a popular upwelling of pro-war sentiment. Rather, it was a lot of American arms manufacturers and a lot of American bankers, particularly the House of J.P. Morgan and Wall Street, had just gotten wrapped up in the war effort of Britain and France, in large part because with the British blockade, they couldn't even trade with Germany and the Central Powers. So almost all of that trade had been nullified and wiped out. In fact, there used to be a critique, the kind of Charles Beard quasi-Marxist progressive critique of the war, that, it was all kind of the U.S. got sucked in because of Wall Street. The real story is much more complicated than that, but there's a little bit of truth in that these interests were increasingly pushing the U.S. towards war. Wilson, somewhat to his credit, was actually resisting that. And in fact, for a while in the winter of 1916-17, the Federal Reserve actually intervened to try to discourage more of this kind of the war finance egging on Britain and France, because Wilson at the time was actually trying to broker a peace. As I pointed out, though, the Germans kind of shot themselves in the foot. So then, I guess it's still hard to convince Americans what they're fighting for. The freedom of the seas was maybe an issue, but again, Britain's violating that too. They're blockading Europe. Perhaps that's less egregious than the German U-boats actually sinking vessels with civilians on board, but it's still a little bit murky. So in the end, part of what Wilson is able to come up with, it's not just the Zimmermann telegram, which I mentioned was when the Germans actually promised effectively the reconquista of the American Southwest to Mexico if she would keep the Americans busy in case the U.S. entered the war, which is just incredibly stupid because it effectively produces the very thing that the Germans should have most feared, which was U.S. intervention once the U.S. government learned about this. On top of this, then, the February Revolution happens in Russia. And as we were talking about this before, this gives Wilson this argument. Well, look, Russia had been an autocracy. Now she's a democracy. And so the famous phrase then emerges, it's a war to make the world safe for democracy. This, at least, is how Wilson sells it to Congress in April 1917. Even then, it's a little ambiguous, though. The U.S. declares war against Germany. She doesn't declare war against Austria-Hungary until almost 8 months later. And the U.S. never actually did declare war on the Ottoman Empire, which by then was closely allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary. One of the really interesting anomalies of the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson, which he announced in January 1918, is that point 12 related to the autonomy of the minority peoples of the Ottoman Empire, and particularly Armenians, Greeks, and others, a country or a power with which the United States was not at war. In fact, by the end of 1918, the Ottomans actually tried to surrender to the United States on the basis of the 14 points, only to be told that they were not at war with the United States.
Yeah, sorry, we have no contract with you.
Right.
It does raise the question of, like, you're out there fighting and you encounter a force that you haven't yet declared war on. What do? You put the arms down. Let's go back to, you mentioned the Lusitania. That's a really interesting case, a story about the Germans bombing a British ship, and it would precede that unlimited submarine warfare thing that you were talking about. So can you just talk about how important the Lusitania was and what happened thereafter in terms of our involvement and the Germans really starting to unravel?
Well, so, the Lusitania, we can certainly exaggerate its significance. It got a lot of press at the time because there were more than 100, I believe, something like 128 Americans on board. And because they were all almost by definition civilians, and even most of the members of the belligerent nationals of the belligerent countries on board were also civilians. We almost certainly know now, even though it was a long and sensitive subject, that there were also at least some weapons on board. But it got a lot of press. And so it basically seemed like this kind of, again, a war crime, a crime against humanity, one of this long line of German atrocities. However, the Germans, as I pointed out earlier, they did respond to it. They did actually tighten their rules of engagement to try to prevent similar accidents. There were one or two other accidents in 1915, that is involving neutral Americans being on board, being sunk in various ships which had been shelled by the U-boats, which didn't get as much press as the Lusitania. But again, the Germans, for a while, they did strengthen the rules of engagement because they were worried about getting the U.S. into the war. The same thing actually is true between 1939 and Pearl Harbor. The Germans actually were quite careful about trying not to violate some of these kind of boundaries in order to draw the Americans into the war. It's one of the reasons why it was so astonishing how short-sighted it was when the Germans again, switch things around in early 1917 in January when they moved towards unrestricted submarine warfare. It also marks the moment as far as internal German politics when the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, the civilian chancellor, effectively gives way to the generals, who effectively kind of take over and overrule his opposition. And a lot of people date really the unraveling of a kind of a more genuine, broad political front behind the German war effort to January 1917. It's not that Germany became a military dictatorship exactly, but it took on some of those characteristics. A kind of almost self-sabotaging power, that just couldn't get out of its own way.
It's the final days for the Christmas and holiday season sale from Genucel. Everyone, listen up. I love this company, and you will too. From now through Christmas, Genucel's most popular package. I love this. They've idiot-proofed it. They've given you all their best stuff. Everything that people love most. So if you're like, I don't know what to get, I don't know what the products are, just get the most popular package. It's right now 70% off at Genucel.com/MK60. Treat yourself and a loved one to the absolute best skincare in the world. See those troubling forehead lines or the fine lines or the skin redness or the pesky bags and puffiness, and even a sagging jawline disappear right before your eyes with Genucel's most popular collection. With its immediate effects product, you see results in less than 12 hours, guaranteed, or you get your money back. And included in every one of their most popular packages is your free hyaluronic acid serum for skin hydration that's going to restore and rejuvenate. I think it resurfaces your youthful appearance. You will feel a difference after you use this stuff. Visit Genucel.com/MK60 now. Enter my special code MK for an additional 10% off your entire order when you check out. Got the 70, got the 10, got the hyaluronic. Every order today is instantly upgraded to free express shipping, guaranteed delivery by Christmas. Don't wait. Genucel.com/MK60. GENUCEL.com/MK60. This is a very thoughtful gift. Genucel.com/MK60. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.